More on our top news story today. The local economy has narrowly averted a technical recession in the fourth quarter. According to Stats SA data, the gross domestic product, measuring the total monetary value of all the finished goods and services produced within the country in the quarter, increased by 0.1% in the quarter. It's up from a contraction of 0.2% in the third quarter. The local economy grew by 0.6% for 2023 as a whole. For more on the GDP data, I'm joined by Xhanti Payi. He's a PwC Senior Economist. Thank you very much, Xhanti, for joining us. So pretty much in line with Treasury's expectations, they had revised that number downwards. Was this in line with your expectations? And what's your general reading of what's come out of the 2023 growth number?
Good afternoon. It's really good to talk to you. Yeah, certainly it was in line with our expectation. That's what the Reserve Bank also had indicated when they delivered their monetary policy statement. So we're quite in line with that. But also, of course, it highlights really the kind of difficulties the South African economy has been seeing. And it's important to think through these numbers close to what we saw even with the data that was released on the unemployment rate that we saw for the fourth quarter of 2023. But certainly, it's quite disappointing.
Yeah. So, as we say in our introduction, we narrowly missed a technical recession because had we seen another contraction in Q4, that would have been a technical recession. That tells us that the South African economy is not doing very well. And I know that you look very closely at what's happening with jobs in the country. What's your sense about, job creation potential this year? We see that there's an expectation that economic growth will be somewhere in the order of about 1.3%, which is still not enough to deal with South Africa's socio-economic woes.
Look, I think it's quite important to first say that if you think about 1.3%, while it's still a low number, it has really doubled the rate of the growth that we are now seeing. And that's something that actually requires that we work really, really, really hard to be able to get to that. We look, for example, at some of the losses that we've seen now. Government expenditure, of course, so government is one sector that declined. We saw a decline, agriculture, an important sector for jobs. We've seen a decline in trade, another important sector, especially if you look at the period that we were coming from. That's the period of the last quarter where the festivities are happening and South Africans are spending a little bit more. And when you look at that, and it tells you something about the state of the South African economy, especially given how important the consumer is to the South African economy. And on a quarterly basis. So certainly the economy is under a lot of pressure. And so if we look then ahead, it's hard to see that if we look at these sectors that are quite critical and they're performing this poorly, how then do we see it getting better? Because the outlook for the consumer continues to be quite dire given the still high interest rate, the low incomes. We are still seeing that, or low income increasing. We're still going to see the difficulties of government because government spending continues to be constrained. So that's something that's going to continue to be with us. So it's difficult to see that this coming year we can actually double that growth rate, given that the challenges we continue to face are still with us.
Yeah. So, Xhanti, where does PwC stand on the efficacy of government tapping onto the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account and using the 150 billion rand not for infrastructure investment or catalytic growth purposes, but to pay down things like debt and settle the unbudgeted public sector wage bill?
What is important about the public sector, about the debt structure of South Africa, first has to do with our investors are looking at this. We are going to struggle because one of the key areas of expenditure, as we've seen, is how much we spend on debt refinancing or debt costs. And that's something that we have to deal with because that can make debt itself unsustainable. And that's, of course, very, very dangerous for a country like us where the growth is quite limited and that we expect that growth to be limited for the foreseeable future. So it is really important that we actually do attend to the debt situation of South Africa because that can actually be something that could lead us into a fiscal crisis. So it's something that's quite important. It is important, of course, for our ratings And our ratings are important because they tell us something about our ability to borrow and we continue to be able to, to finance. Because obviously, one of the things we note when a credit rating of a sovereign is low, it also affects the banking sector. And so actually and the cost of borrowing for the entire economy. So it is important that we deal with that because that will have permeating impact on the entire economy. So it is something that's quite important to handle, to deal with, apart from the fact that it's constraining our expenditure across the board.
Yeah, no, I do understand that, of course, addressing debt is very important. But I think the main issue that people are concerned about is that we're not addressing the underlying issue of ensuring that we get decent economic growth, above 3%. We seem to be content with 1.5%, which is about the same rate as the population growth. GDP per capita keeps on contracting. We're not really getting full benefit in terms of growth and therefore job creation. So what do you think about our structural reforms? Are we where we need to be in order to inject that sort of level of confidence where we're going to see growth pick up in years to come?
And that's really where we are so concerned about, what the minister really put out in terms of the forecasts in the budget when he talks about the growth trajectory. And you're quite right, our expenditure on infrastructure remains quite low. But that there is, I guess, in a sense, the idea that if we don't do this and if we don't grow this economy, then we are going to miss the fiscal targets. Then it's going to obviously spiral out of control. We really must do focus. Operation Bulindlela has been coming up quite nicely, but that needs to be stated up. Yesterday, I was listening to the chairperson of Transnet, trying to show that they are continuing to do a lot of work, bring in the private sector. It seems that the government also has to rely quite a bit, and I think that answers part of the question, that there's now a growing reliance on the private sector. This is interesting, of course, because I guess in a long term, the private sector has been saying that they want to play a bigger role in South Africa's economic growth. So that's one thing that I guess is starting to happen. And that could actually spur, better growth if the reforms themselves are not coming up very strongly on the part of government. So I guess there is this tension that we are starting to see, but certainly over the long term, we must build on infrastructure. I just spent now some time in the Gauteng province budget. And again, there is a focus on infrastructure, but it's just not the right quantums that we need to be putting down to make sure that we can actually spur this economy better to better growth.
Yeah, Xhanti, thank you so much for your contributions. As always, Xhanti Payi, he's a senior economist at PwC.